Great, so we're right at the bottom of the hour, and so I want to go ahead and welcome everyone and thank you for joining what promises to be an insightful and candid conversation about an increasingly relevant topic of supply chain security. For the last decade, the public and private sectors have faced increasing complications managing complex and dispersed international supply chains. The issues confronted are extensive. Physical and cybersecurity vulnerabilities, trade and customs compliance, the threat of malign foreign influence, and supply chain resiliency are only a handful of the many challenges within the global supply chain. There are multiple stakeholders, including governments, regulators, companies, and their sub-tier subcontractors and suppliers across all geographies. Navigating this environment requires a holistic and integrated approach to supply chain security. Today's webinar is entitled Supply Chain Security, Managing Risk Amidst a Changing Geopolitical Landscape. And while this hints at a wide variety of issues that affect a wide variety of stakeholders, there is an increasing number of commonalities between CSOs, CISOs, supply chain managers, general counsels, and their counterparts in government, much of which we'll try and touch on today. Today's panel includes key leadership from the Chertoff Group. The Chertoff Group is a premier security advisory firm established in 2009 by former United States Department of Homeland Security Secretary Michael Chertoff. The Chertoff Group's executives have built security and intelligence programs for multiple federal and private sector clients and conducted dozens of comprehensive risk assessments, offering unparalleled insights into client supply chains and using the firm's Safety Act designated risk management methodology. It helps clients assess, mitigate, and monitor supply chain risk in today's dynamic environment. Both in-house and through its network of providers, the Chertoff Group supply chain risk management process addresses challenges across all nodes of its client supply chains. My name is Brogan Ingstead. I'm an associate in the Chertoff Group's Strategic Advisory Services practice, and I'll be moderating the session today. We have 1 hour allocated for this webinar, and we'll move through a series of questions that touch on multiple aspects of the topic at hand. At the end, time permitting, we'll open up the session to audience Q&A, and everybody will be able to see that on the webinar platform, you can actually submit a question at any point throughout the webinar, and we'll try to aim to select a few of these towards the end to touch on the audience's concerns. I'd now like to briefly introduce the outstanding group of panelists that we have on the call today. Leading us off is Michael Chertoff, the co-founder and chairman of Chertoff Group. Secretary Chertoff gave up lifetime federal appeals court judgeship to serve as Secretary of Homeland Security between 2005 and 2009. While at DHS, he delivered the largest reorganization of the federal civilian workforce since World War II. Previously, he was head of the U.S. Department of Justice's criminal division, where he investigated and prosecuted cases of political corruption, organized crime, corporate fraud, and terrorism, including the investigation of the 9/11 terrorist attacks. He began his career as a federal prosecutor in New York in 1983, where he led simultaneous prosecutions of the head of 5 major mafia crime families. Mr. Chertoff also serves as chairman of the board of directors at BAE and senior of counsel at Covington & Burling. Secretary Chertoff is joined by Mira Ricardel, a principal at the Chertoff Group, where she leverages her extensive experience in regulatory policies and processes related to national security to advise a wide variety of clients. From 2016 to 2018, she held presidential appointments at the Department of Commerce and the White House. While at the White House, she was assistant to the president and deputy national security advisor. Prior to that, she served as the Undersecretary for Commerce for Export Administration, leading the Bureau of Industry and Security, where she played a leadership role in the development of regulations related to the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, U.S. export controls, and policies on supply chain security. Mira also has nearly a decade of aerospace industry experience as vice president of Boeing Company, where she was focused on business development in the areas of missile, defense, satellites, cyber, and advanced technology. Joining Secretary Chertoff and Mira is Adam Isles, a principal at the Chertoff Group, where he leads the firm's cybersecurity team. He spent the better part of the last decade working with large global companies to help them manage cyber risk. He has a 20-plus year career in security, including serving as the Deputy Chief of Staff to Secretary Chertoff at DHS. He started his legal career as a trial attorney in the Justice Department's criminal division, where he did early work on international cybercrime cooperation. Secretary Chertoff, Mira, Adam, thanks so much for all three of you for joining us today.
Thank you, Brogan.
So, Secretary Chertoff, I think we'll start this off with you and hopefully to set the lay of the land a little bit. Obviously, companies over the last year have had to adapt to a multitude of issues, and COVID-19 is certainly the obvious one, but be it civil unrest around the world, natural disasters, and certainly this decoupling effort that's underway with China, there's just a lot for companies to have to think about. So I'm hoping that you might be able to just set the stage of the current situation and maybe help us understand a bit more of why we are where we are.
Well, thank you, Brogan. Again, a very timely topic. And I would say there are a number of factors that have come into play recently that have really put a lot of stress on our traditional supply chain processes. First, obviously, is the pandemic. And actually, to that, I would add some of the other natural disasters we're facing as a result of climate change, including fires out west, flooding and hurricanes in various parts of the world, and of course, the pandemic itself. And what this has done is it has made it difficult for traditional workforce to go to work. It's affected transportation. It has been a concern because people are worried about getting infected. And all of this has, to some degree or another, slowed or dislocated the ordinary movement of the supply chain, which many companies were simply familiar with and took for granted. You even see that, for example, with respect to food supplies, where there are interruptions because of the fact that you have either problems in the growing areas or problems in the shipping and transportation areas. A second issue is, after having spent really much of the last few decades integrating our economy with that of foreign countries, including China, which is, of course, a geopolitical rival of ours, there's now been a reversal of that trend and a movement towards decoupling, which we can talk about. The idea being that for national security reasons, undue reliance on China as a major or even sole source of supply exposes Western nations to coercion and leverage, which the Chinese have demonstrated themselves willing to deploy in other parts of the world. And so that has also caused the dislocation and disruption of the traditional supply chain as it relates to things coming out of China. A third factor is simply the culmination of a long-standing trend towards, just-in-time, hyper-efficient management of the supply process. It was taken as an article of faith years ago that you didn't want to have a lot of excess capacity sitting around at your point of sale. You wanted to wait until just right before you needed something, and then have the component delivered and integrated into your product or your system. The problem is that eliminates resiliency. And when you hit bumps in the road like the two earlier ones I mentioned, all of a sudden there's a ripple effect because now you've thrown a monkey wrench into your traditional processes for integrating the supplies. So all of these have increased risk to the supply chain. And I do want to emphasize that as we talk about risk to the supply chain, which is true when we talk about risk in any area of human endeavor, it's not about trying to eliminate risk because that's never possible, but it's about trying to manage risk. And that means assessing what the most significant consequences of the risk are, what your greatest vulnerabilities are, and what are the either natural or man-made threats to your processes.
Thank you, Secretary. I think that's a great introduction, and the goal today, I think, is to dive into several of the issues that you noted, as well as thinking about frameworks and ways that we can apply certain elements across the board to a wide variety of risks across the logistical enterprise of organization. Maybe to stick with you and just to right off the bat get a COVID-19 question out of the way. From your perspective, as you look at COVID-19 and the effect that it's had on supply chain, what have we learned from that about the state of the current global economy, particularly from a supply chain perspective?
Well, I mean, I think we've had underscored the fact that we are highly interdependent. That's true with respect to raw materials. As I said earlier, it's with respect to food and things that we consume. I might add that, for example, if you're a wine drinker, what's going on out in California is probably impacting your ability to get the wines you like to drink. We're also seeing that competition for critical resources like vaccines is very much still a part of the global economy. I mean, we may say that we are one world economy, but in the end, governments do feel a responsibility for their own citizens. And that means if much of the resource is concentrated in one particular country, and we need that in order to develop either palliatives or vaccines to be distributed around the world, we now find ourselves in a precarious position because we take a back seat to the country which actually has the critical raw material. So this is about dispersing your sources of supply, having alternative plans in case your principal way of operating is disrupted. And again, that's about risk management. It's about having plan B and plan C.
Great. Thank you, Secretary. Secretary Chertoff mentioned China and the decoupling effort underway. And Mira, I want to turn to you on this to speak just a bit about, you have a long background both in and out of government, kind of addressing and thinking critically about these issues. When you see the tensions that are currently underway, what is your assessment of the current dynamics and where this might be heading, and particularly from a supply chain context?
Thank you, Brogan. Certainly, I think as a backdrop, before we even get to this year, it was inevitable that we would have more tensions, partly because China's policies under President Xi were going to make China more dominant in not just the economy, but also in the South China Sea area, et cetera. So you had policies like Made in China 2025 that set out various priorities for critical technologies. And so you have that as a backdrop, and then we get into the last few years in particular, and we've seen a pattern of both Chinese licit and illicit behavior that was focused very much on access to these technologies. So the USTR has gone on at some length in their reporting on IP theft. We've seen export diversion and sanctions for those diversions. For example, those sanctions against Huawei and ZTE. And then you put on top of this all the coronavirus pandemic, and the trust has further eroded between the US and China. And then if that wasn't enough for this year, we had the national security law passed with respect to Hong Kong. We had greater sensitivity to data concerns, as the debate on TikTok has highlighted. And that wasn't the first data issue. Of course, you go back to many of us who are in government who had our various information stolen through a cyber attack on the Office of Personnel Management. So again, all of these things are factors in driving a shift in our supply chains. But I think, as the Secretary has noted, one of the things about decoupling, it's easier on paper than it is in reality. We are highly integrated. Many US companies and Chinese companies are highly integrated, and decoupling is difficult, whether it's pharmaceuticals, whether it's semiconductors, and all of these efforts reveal the dependencies that are there. And we're just at the beginning. And so it's, I think, and thinking ahead, we'll see more executive orders. Today there was one on critical minerals and what needs to be done in that area. We've had human rights come into the fore, and there's legislation now related to products that are made by the Uyghur population, which has been severely repressed by the PRC government. And so, and that's going to have an impact, I would say, on retail in particular. So I think companies need to be poised to make changes in their supply chain if they have them in China. At the same time, the US government, whether it's the executive branch or the Congress, need to understand that these are complex matters, and we don't want to hurt our economy in this situation even more than we're hurting our supposed adversary. So I think the other final point is that China's not standing by. China is taking its own actions. They've announced an unreliable list of suppliers and threatening to put really big American companies on it, and smaller ones, I'm sure, as well. And so while these are complicated issues, I don't see the situation going away, and it's going to take some very savvy navigation, both on the industry side and on the government side, to make the changes to adjust.
Thanks, Mira. Mr. Secretary, you've spent a big part of your career writing and speaking and publicly speaking about the China issue. Did you have anything that you wanted to add to Mira's comments?
Well, I think Mira's exactly right, and I think this really reflects a sea change. Excuse me, a sea change that occurred when Xi became president. Because before that, we were hopeful, and there was some reason to be optimistic, that China was migrating more to a somewhat more open political system, and obviously a much freer market. Although we've been concerned for some time about the theft of intellectual property. But Xi's been much more of a reversion to the Maoist authoritarian model of governing China. And so he's been much more aggressive. We've also seen, by the way, the Chinese using their investment resources in order to embed themselves in other parts of the world, and therefore to have leverage and control over other countries which possess critical natural resources. And part of the problem is we have not been competing in the same arena until recently. Our view was you treat economics as separate from security, and we didn't really invest a lot in building up investment in, again, the Southern Hemisphere as a way of counterbalancing China in the competition for critical resources. That's beginning to change. Congress passed a piece of legislation called ARIA that's designed to promote investment in Southeast Asia by American companies so that we can begin to, again, level the playing field.
Great, thank you. Adam, I want to pivot over to you a little bit, and it's obviously a related point around technology risk and the idea that companies that have software development activities or related high-tech technology, they're very much at the forefront of a lot of these changes between COVID and the Chinese elements that Mira and the Secretary just spoke to. So could you, maybe lay out a bit the technology risk landscape as you see it and how that's changing in the current environment?
Yeah, let me talk about change. I think let me unpack it into the geopolitical risks we talked about in COVID. I think on the geopolitical side, we're talking about kind of a growing appreciation of what may be kind of an existing risk of technology as a stepping stone into victim organizations. With COVID, we're seeing significantly changed risks based on underlying public health and business changes. So Mira talked about TikTok, right? One of the central issues, according to press reporting and kind of the TikTok issue is access to source code, right? And will source code be made available to inspection? We've seen over the last years kind of a steady increase of software being subverted basically as an intrusion vector into organizations. We saw it in NotPetya in 2017, where global shipping organizations, logistics organizations like Maersk and FedEx were victimized. And the intrusion vector was tax accounting software that had malware basically inserted as part of the software update process. We've seen it with computer optimization tools like CCleaner, where the development process within CCleaner was subverted. Malware was inserted in it, 2 million plus downloads, but before security researchers uncovered the back door. And, we're seeing it again, this year in tax software that's designed to enable payment of taxes in China with backdoors in it. So we're seeing on the part of regulators and the part of customers, growing appreciation for, for kind of software risk. Question we'll talk about more later maybe is what to do about it. On the COVID side, right, we're seeing significantly changed risks to the supply chain environment. So if you think of like a make, move, sell in a supply chain context, let's unpack that, right? From a make perspective, what COVID has done is it's forced everyone into a work from home environment, not just organizations, but their vendors as well. And so when you think about manufacturing sites, what does that mean for vendor access and what vendor access looks like now versus what it might have looked like before? What does it look like for offshore delivery centers from the point of view of IT outsourcing? When we move from make to move and we start thinking about how you're getting products from one place to another, we're seeing increasing instances of ransomware impacting logistics providers. We saw an Australian logistics provider impacted actually twice this year. And then as we move from move to sell, right, what has COVID done, right? We've seen this massive shift from, purchases in bricks and mortar stores to e-commerce. And I think we've seen, a $200 billion of purchases from US retailers in the second quarter of 2020. That's up almost 50% from the same time last year. And so as we see this massive shift to e-commerce, we see an increasing what are known as e-skimming attacks, right? Where you have the checkout page infected with a malicious script that diverts credit card data and malicious sites. So what does that mean for companies, right? It really means three things, right? First, you got to think about how secure the technology you're using is for you and your suppliers. Second, you've got to think about what level of resiliency you have for where your suppliers themselves are incapacitated. And third, you got to think about whether you're keeping up with changing business models as a result of the contingencies we've just been talking about.
Great, that's helpful, Adam. And so we thought we'd be useful here to pause. There's been a lot covered and a lot of large scale issues, but we thought we'd do a little bit of audience engagement. Just a very quick poll, which should be launching right there on the screen, and we'll take 20 seconds here. The question that we wanted to ask is which of the following best reflects your organization's biggest supply chain concern at the moment? Disruption caused by COVID-19, disruption caused by natural disasters, potential for civil unrest, regulatory activity directed at foreign influence concerns. So we'll take 20 seconds just to let everybody respond, and then we'll close and put it up on the screen. Okay, and so we see 48% of disruption caused by COVID-19, and there was definitely dozens of people who responded to this. So we have 48% over COVID-19, 45% regulatory activity directed at foreign influence concerns, and a smaller percentage with civil unrest and natural disasters. So that good news for the webinar today, in terms of just those are some of the main topics we were looking at discussing and diving into, but I think it's not surprising. And we'd encourage, if there's any additional questions that people have, to throw them into the webinar platform here, and we'll attempt to address those as we get farther along in the webinar. But moving on, so now the question is sort of, what do we do about it? And we spent a lot of time at the Chertoff Group thinking through frameworks for supply chain risk management and efforts that companies can take to really address some of these concerns in a coherent way across a wide variety of risk surfaces. So I wanted to, potentially starting with you, Mr. Secretary, the question is really, given all this, what strategies or process changes can companies adopt to better insulate themselves and build a level of resilience across their supply chains? And particularly given your experience at DHS, running contingency planning there, I thought it might be useful to start there with you.
So I begin by saying that, exactly how you address the problem is going to depend where you are in the supply chain. Are you a product manufacturer? Are you someone who's integrating products into a larger system? Are you an asset owner? And Adam will get into a little more detail about the different way that may affect the way you look at this. But to stand back in general, any crisis can only be confronted if you've done planning. It's not that planning necessarily gives you a precise roadmap to what you need to do, but the process of planning identifies the things you need to be concerned about, tells you the capabilities you need in order to manage a crisis, gives you some training into how you might respond to various scenarios, and also make sure that people understand their authorities and their responsibilities when there is a crisis. So when you look at the issue of the supply chain, whether it's the pandemic or natural disaster, or as Adam pointed out, a ransomware attack, and we saw, for example, when NotPetya ransomware was launched, it incidentally infected Maersk, the shipping company, and that really seriously impacted their business operations because they couldn't get access to their data for a while, and that then has a ripple effect across the entire supply chain. So I would say you've got to begin by understanding, okay, what are the things you're most vulnerable to if there's a disruption of the supply chain? And then the question is, how do you manage the resiliency? Have you identified alternative sources of supply? Do you have a plan for switching from one locus to another if you need to do so, let's say if there is a ransomware attack? If you are a supplier or a transport company, do you have a backup system so that if you are the subject of a ransomware attack, you have the ability to get at the data in a relatively efficient way so you can continue to operate? And if you can't, do you have a plan for how you would at least close the gap? And I'll give you one example from something we worked on a few years ago. We did a scenario for a bank on what would happen if your provider of identity solutions all of a sudden was the subject of a cyber attack, and they basically shut down, and identification credentials for bank customers could no longer be accessed by the customers. Now, the bank, the first reaction was, well, we may have to shut down operations until it's fixed. But that, of course, would drive the customers away and make them very angry. As we worked through the process, they realized that actually there were patterns of transaction that were very regular and customary in terms of the payor and the payee, like a payroll, for example, and that those could continue because you're not heavily reliant on identity credentials, but really the behavioral analytics gets you the confidence you need. So then the question is, can you then now identify those customer sets that fall in that category, and then that takes that hay off the haystack, so you can focus more narrowly on the people where you don't have a backup. That's the kind of contingency planning you need to be engaged in at any point in the supply chain.
So those are great comments, Secretary. Adam, do you have anything you want to add, maybe from a framework perspective?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think when we look across, physical and technology supply chains, there are kind of 5 key elements that keep coming up, right? Visibility, risk, defense in depth, what Secretary Chertoff talked about around contingency planning and testing and validation. And so from a visibility point of view, what we're trying to get at is, do we have centralized visibility on, the providers and products and services, both physical and technology in our supply chain? This is obviously if you're at the top of the food chain, if you will. And it sounds simple enough, but we see challenges across, clients with how this actually applies, particularly at the margins. What about goods and services that are acquired, not through, centralized IT or through a centralized procurement process? How do you deal with, newly integrated, M&A, acquisitions? How do we deal with how things work in different regions? When we get to risk, right, we're looking, not just at who are our strategic suppliers, both in a technology and a non-technology context, but where in the world do they develop their products? Where in the world do they actually physically deliver those services from? That becomes relevant for all sorts of reasons. From a defense in depth perspective, then we're thinking about, what controls are in place actually to limit risk here, right? Both within our own organizations and our suppliers. And do the controls actually apply across the life cycle of a customer relationship? All right, I bought a product, but how am I thinking about technology updates and upgrades, customer service with respect to that product? Secretary Chertoff talked a lot about contingency planning. We've actually seen, winners and losers, out of good contingency planning. You go back to the Great East Japan earthquake of 2011 and the Fukushima nuclear disaster. Different auto manufacturers, held more inventory, had, considerably more global supply chains than others, and that was reflected in the stock price. So we've seen those results. And then from a testing and validation point of view, part of what we're looking for, right, is to continuously validate the suppliers are doing what they're supposed to be doing. So how are people leveraging service level agreements? Quarterly business reviews for strategic suppliers, proof of independent testing and validation. And continuous monitoring. I mean, all of this comes back to, where we started, which is kind of from an enterprise risk management point of view, where we continuously assessing, mitigating, and monitoring risk associated with our supply chain.
That's very helpful, Adam. And I think hopefully that framework is useful to a lot of the panelists, the participants in the webinar today. Pivoting slightly, it feels like Chertoff Group based here in Washington, D.C., you can't throw a stone in the supply chain community without talking about CFIUS. And so we want to at least do somewhat of a deep dive into the current situation with CFIUS here and what that means for the whole broader conversation around foreign investment. So obviously this is one of the primary mechanisms for investigating and enforcing supply chain concerns. Mira, Secretary Chertoff, maybe starting with you, you've obviously tracked the issue of CFIUS closely, particularly in a post 9/11 environment. Could you help us maybe track that trajectory a bit and how we got from maybe post 9/11 till now?
Yeah, and I've been involved with CFIUS for 20 years, since I was with the Department of Justice, and it has clearly evolved and become a much more significant factor in the investment process in the United States. Just for some background, this started out as Team Telecom. If you go back decades, the idea was that if you had a foreign provider that wanted to acquire a U.S. telephone company or some communications company, the government wanted to be sure that that was going to be a reliable partner if there was a need, for example, to enforce a court order on wiretapping or electronic surveillance. So that was a fairly narrow set of concerns, and it was really lodged in the Department of Justice. That eventually broadened into CFIUS, which is a committee that's composed of representatives of all the major agencies, economic and national security, that were really brought together to look at a broader set of possible transactions, concerns about not only the original impulse to protect communications, but concerns about possible espionage, about a foreign government using its control over a critical U.S. company, particularly the defense industry, in order to impede or disrupt the ability to provide the U.S. with necessary national security tools. And so even we got to the point that if certain adversary nations wanted to buy a piece of property for an amusement park, but it happened to be situated to overlook a critical military base, that became a CFIUS issue because, again, it might be a platform for espionage or even sabotage. So CFIUS really grew into a more general set of issues. One of the most interesting recent developments, and I know that Mira will talk about this in greater depth, that I began to see kind of in the last 10 years was an increased concern on personal data of Americans being accessed by foreign governments for their own purposes. I'm not talking here about espionage where you're getting national security secrets. I mean things like driver's license records, things that are not inherently what you would think of as national security. But in the aggregate, if you can collect all of that information, you can get a pretty interesting perspective on what's going on in the US, and in particular, who might be, for example, an undercover operative or a critical government actor. And that's been enhanced by artificial intelligence. Mira mentioned the OPM hack. That was about 25 million files on people who had applied for clearances with the government. That's obviously critical information. You would normally say, well, who could make use of that, by reviewing 25 million files. But now with artificial intelligence, that could be digested and made operationally significant very quickly. So that again has now become an increasing concern for CFIUS, which is there personal data, even if it's relatively innocuous, that's going to be exposed through this transaction?
Great, thank you, Secretary. Mira, obviously you've been in the space for a long time and work critically at the Chertoff Group on some of these issues. Any thoughts that you have about the current state of play within CFIUS?
Thank you, Brogan. Well, building on what the Secretary talked about, yes, we've seen this concern about data and aggregation of data. But I think more generally, even there's been a broader definition of national security, which has gone from, I think, the initial team telecom, then maybe more aerospace and defense. After 9/11, you saw a focus on homeland security type matters and infrastructure. And today, we see this convergence of national security and economic security concerns that focus a lot on technology and protecting that technology. And so we saw a year and a half ago, approximately almost 2 years ago, this FIRMA legislation update of the CFIUS regulations being passed overwhelmingly in a bipartisan manner, which is a rarity these days in Washington, driven by a concern about maintaining the United States' technological edge. At the same time, it broadened the categories that are being reviewed and scrutinized by the CFIUS committee to focus especially on critical and emerging technologies, artificial intelligence being one that the Secretary just mentioned, semiconductors, electronics, also machine learning, genomics, critical infrastructure being broadened beyond just military installations to key airports and transportation hubs, for example. At the same time, sensitive data being articulated. What is sensitive data? It's the PII type data, but also health data, financial data, and the ability to aggregate that data. So anything that would, any kind of technology that could, let's say, sweep up more than 1 million data points from residents in the United States. At the same time, the committee's, the legislations which went into effect this past February expanded the purview of the committee to non-controlling investments, minority investments, any kind of investment that could afford the investor access to technology information, to influence on a company. And a lot of that was in response to Chinese behavior in terms of their investments and how they used investments to access technological information. Finally, I think as you look at it, the government looked in implementing these regulations to try to really motivate countries to behave like us. and to also be reviewing these kinds of investments. And so trust investors were enumerated in the regulation. Canada, the UK, and Australia were named as accepted investors. So I think, you know, you have to look at this as really a seismic shift in the foreign direct investment landscape in the US. We've already seen the statistics on declines in especially Chinese investment into Silicon Valley in particular, but also finally the thing that's probably been most in the news, and we're back to TikTok, is that the CFIUS committee is looking at past deals in the recent past that have some of these same attributes, especially related to data. And that's how we first got into this TikTok scenario, was through a review of by the CFIUS committee before we even got to the executive orders that came out from the president. And I think it's a whole new world out there in foreign direct investment.
Absolutely. So, I mean, I've seen you at the Chertoff Group, you guide multiple companies through this CFIUS approval process, and there's a lot of key considerations. I mean, what would you, in terms of what all what you've just said means for companies, what would be some of your key takeaways for firms that are trying to navigate that process and go through these approvals?
Well, I think the first thing, and it gets to a point the Secretary made about looking at supply chains and contingencies with COVID now, it's planning. You have to plan for this up front. In the past, due diligence, I think, had really much more of a financial focus. It was even seen as synonymous with finance and legal reviews. Right now, I think you have to thinking of if you're looking at a foreign investor, you need to anticipate how CFIUS may respond to that investment. Who are the investors? Where are they from? What are the potential US government sensitivities? And these are not legal matters necessarily. They could be policy matters. What executive orders are in the pipeline? Are there new regulations that will give you a clue that this is going to have an effect on the transaction being proposed? And if there is critical technology involved, we'll anticipate whether there may be mitigations required. And as the Secretary also noted, mitigation is not eliminating risk, it's managing risk. Now, in some cases, and many cases, frankly, with Russia and China, the US government will not see that as risk that can be managed. But we'll get back to that in a second. The bottom line is you need to plan for this up front, even if it's considering what mitigation scenarios might be there. And that will help lead to a smoother process and potentially more successful outcome. And just getting back to mitigation, the US, as you look at especially the IT companies, the US government focus on software supply chains means that any transactions in these areas will be looking at that as well, and potential, whether or not these things can be mitigated if there are overseas supply chains. And so I think Adam would probably be in the best position to talk about kind of what considerations companies with a heavy focus in software development and overseas operations, what they need to keep in mind and how they need to approach this.
Yeah, totally, Mira, and thanks for that. I mean, I think, and part of what you were hinting at is this is certainly an issue where in CFIUS transactions, but even where there is no CFIUS issue, we're seeing these matters come up, and you're seeing more aggressive use of existing authorities, at both the DHS and DoD, as well as new authorities through executive orders and things like the Secure Technologies Act. Part of the challenge here is that there's not an existing standard. You can't go to NIST 800-53 or NIST 800-171, or frankly even CMMC, at DoD, and say how do we look at what good software lifecycle security looks like? How do we consider issues like, could the code repository be compromised? Is what's tested actually what's released? How are we dealing with new vulnerabilities in open source? After a product that has those open source libraries and then is released. The good news is first of all, that there are kind of emerging frameworks and some existing ones as well that speak more directly to this. I mean, BSIM is a framework that's been out there for a long time. More recently, NIST has released a secure software development framework. The Business Software Alliance has released its own. And these provide a much more complete picture of what software lifecycle security looks like. If you apply the kind of the 5 elements I talked about a little bit earlier, visibility, risk, layered defense, contingency planning, and testing, they kind of fit into this model, right? And so from a visibility point of view, part of, we think about risk as a function of, threat, vulnerability, and consequence. Part of what's, creating additional vulnerability is just you've had a proliferation of third-party open source libraries, which are good. The question is, how they're managed in terms of being vetted and used in a product. The Department of Commerce has been working on a software bill of materials initiative, right, to provide greater transparency into the software components, for better security across the digital ecosystem. I'd be paying, if I were involved in software development, in where both regulators and customers are headed and being interested in software bills of materials. We're also looking for visibility in the subcontractors, and Mira talked also about geography and where development activities actually occur. From a risk point of view, I think it's really important that the business teams start to think about, well, what does a bad day look like for our customers, if the software were somehow to be misused. From a layered defense point of view, we're looking at issues of, does the approach actually, given the complexity of software development right now, represent something that's intuitive to software developers? How do you integrate security with the complex software development environment that exists today? How do we think about attributability and deterrence in the context of software development? How do we think about trusted infrastructure? In other words, how is the code repository itself? How are the tool chains being locked down? And I do think it's also important to think about customer security. What I mean by that is not just the code itself is secure, but also our security features for customers being designed in terms of secure default settings, in terms of appropriate customer logging, in terms of customer identity and access management that will make for secure use of these technologies in use. Testing becomes really relevant as well, right? We think about risk-based testing, independent testing, and critically important is what tested, equal what gets released. And then lastly, contingency planning, right? I mean, what happens if a vulnerability is discovered in an open source library after a software product's released? And what happens if you've got an outside security researcher that identifies a flaw? And how do we get to end users? So I think those are some of the considerations as we look at, okay, we know what bad looks like, but what does good look like in a software development context in this increasingly complex environment?
Great, thanks for that, Adam. Maybe one last question for me, pivoting slightly before we move over to a couple really good questions I've seen come in from the audience. Maybe starting with you, Mr. Secretary, a lot of what we hear about in the security risk management field is this convergence, right, of physical and cybersecurity programs that happens through the programs themselves or potentially converged GSOCs. And wondering if from your perspective, are there areas in the supply chain context where a lot of these roles are overlapping between physical and cyber realms, where you have CSOs, CISOs, supply chain VP functions? Is there any integration that you're seeing in that space to where this challenge has become a bit more integrated?
Yes, I mean, I think people who've been involved in security risk management have understood for quite some time that although we talk about cyberspace as if it's not another dimension of the universe, it's actually a physical dimension too. There's hardware, there's software, there's servers, and physical access and physical security becomes an important element of cybersecurity, and vice versa. People will remember a few years ago, Target was hacked. And a lot of customer data was stolen. And that was because an HVAC supplier, someone who's coming to do their check on their air conditioning and heating system, plugged in their electronics to the system. They were infected, and the infection got into the system and led to the malware going in. We've seen that, for example, there was I won't mention the name, but there was an institution in Washington, a private one, that was hacked because there was access to a remote thermostat. And Adam will remember this. I won't again mention the company, but we were asked to do for a client kind of a red teaming effort to hack into their systems. They had quite a good online network defense, but when we sent people into the building lobby with a bogus claim they were going to meet somebody in the building, and they were ushered into the waiting area, and they booted up their laptops, they were relatively easily able to penetrate the unprotected wireless network inside the building, and that gave them access to the whole network. So you see that physical access is a critical element of cybersecurity. And the same is true on the other side. We've seen instances where cyber attacks have been used either to disable operating industrial control systems, like was done in Ukraine a few years ago with the power system, or as I said earlier with Maersk, ransomware taking down the ability to manage the supply chain because you can no longer access your records about who's ordered what and when it's due. So you have to look at these as being part of a single package and not as fragmented issues.
I would just add, even when we looked at 2020, right, we saw in Israel earlier this year, water treatment plant, attacked, and was that to disrupt the water supply? Was it to try and over-chlorinate the water? Who knows? But that's a situation where you had a cyber attack, looking towards a physical effect that impacts, human safety, as well as when you think about interdependencies in economies, right? Everything else runs on water. Electricity, factories, all dependent on water systems.
Right. Thank you, Adam. So I think now's a good time. We'll move over and do a couple of questions for the audience. Seen some really good ones come in. Adam, maybe we'll start with this one. Looks like it's probably directed at you, and you mentioned the software bill of materials question. So reading this line by line, two initiatives gaining momentum in the pursuit of better supply chain risk management are digital bill of materials and software bill of materials programs to look at a more granular level of the supply chain. These have significant national security implications when you look at the vastness of our critical infrastructure supply chain. When does government step in and require more structured supply chain cybersecurity controls?
Well, I think there's a chicken and egg issue of, when are there frameworks out there that are available for both, consumers and producers of a software bill of materials to be ready. I mean, I think we'll, even as early as October, we'll see some updated generalized guidance coming out of the Department of Commerce. And I think in the healthcare field, there are actually, pilots underway with the health systems in this country to actually test this out. I would say this becomes more a question of more broadly of incentivization, right? And so what are the levers to incentivization, right? One is procurement. And so I think what's going to be interesting both in the government and the commercial sector is to say how can a bill of materials start to become a kind of a source selection factor for government customers and for critical infrastructure customers. I think beyond procurement, right? You think about levers like liability limitation, regulation. And we're seeing, on the regulatory front, we're seeing again in medical devices, the FDA move forward with some focus here. But I think it's a chicken and egg issue in terms of making sure that the tools are there to be adopted. And I think that you have things like software composition analysis tools that are out there that are available. It's a question, I think, also, okay, like you get the information, what do you do with it? But I think this is definitely something to keep an eye on and plan for as this capability moves forward.
Let me add one thing, Brogan. There's a real focus now on the Internet of Things and smart devices, which are going to be integrated into homes or businesses, larger networks. I know the British put out a few years ago a kind of a prescription of basic practices that they strongly recommended. I think that's now actually moved over to becoming a legal requirement. So I think you're going to see more and more of that, particularly when you're dealing with items that are relatively small and inexpensive, have very little security. And the question is, how do you assure the customer they're not introducing something that's a serious vulnerability into their personal networks?
Great, thank you, Secretary. So maybe staying with you, there's a question that's come in about how AI can be leveraged to identify vulnerabilities in supply chains, especially internationally or global supply chains. Secretary, do you have any thoughts on that?
I do. I mean, I think that again, artificial intelligence is not a cure-all, but it has real benefit when you're looking at large amounts of data and you're trying to focus on the things that are most important based upon what your critical interests are. So whether you're dealing with issues of pandemic and where we think medical issue emergencies are likely to pop up and intensify, or if we're dealing with behavior questions where we're looking at a large mass of data in terms of the way the network is being used, artificial intelligence can say, here's something that's anomalous or something that's intensifying at a worrying rate, and then that can help you begin to anticipate a problem before it happens. Frankly, I think if we'd had more visibility into the early stages of the pandemic with an international effort to consolidate the data, we might have had a jump start a little early on where this was going, and that might have allowed us to respond collectively in a more efficient way. Maybe that'll be one of the takeaways of this rather difficult experience.
Great, thank you, Secretary. Mira, maybe a question for you here around the China element. Will the inflection point that's going on with China right now drive a sustained rotation away from the country as a reliable partner?
Well, I think we've already seen that rotation start and questions about the reliability of China as a partner. That's not to say all Chinese companies are unreliable. I think there's a concern about how much access the state has, even into non-state-owned enterprises. And so the way to manage that risk is going to be to limit certain partnerships or investments that are in areas deemed as sensitive, whether it be data or technology or infrastructure. So I think the rotation's begun. I don't see this trend reversing itself. It may ebb and flow a bit based on various developments and also the complexities of these supply chains that we have. But I think we're in a new era that's not going away.
We'll just add, one thing. I mean, I think, China is also an export market for us and for non-sensitive materials as well as sensitive. And if you think about retail, I mean, retail, accounts for, it touches somehow, almost 1 in 4 jobs in this country, and it's in extremis right now based on COVID. And so I think part of, in a policy context, the questions that will come out is how do we make sure that we're nimble enough in our approach that we don't also unintentionally impact, non-technology sensitive, non-PI sensitive business, that is driving U.S. exports.
Exactly, and I think just one footnote on Adam's point, there was actually this exact debate in the House on recent legislation that related to the products being produced by Uyghur population in China, and part of the debate was whether what the impact of the regulation is on retailers. So I think that's not to say that there was a dispute over the human rights elements of this, but it was really about how to manage that and what the economic impact is. And again, is the medicine worse than what you're trying to cure?
Great, thanks everybody for the great responses. So I think I'll probably reserve my right as moderator for the last question, and just to kind of wrap up everything together, and we'll get everybody, Adam, Mira, and Secretary, Mr. Secretary, we'll get your views on all of this. But basically, it's where are we heading? Where do we see supply chain risk management going over the next 5 years? And I know there's a lot of executives and practitioners in supply chain on the line. So what should they kind of be mindful of as we look ahead? Maybe Adam, we'll start with you.
Yeah, just quickly, in terms of cyber implications for the physical supply chain, you look at CTPAT, the Customs Trade Partnership Against Terrorism, and you've seen this year new cybersecurity requirements added into that program. You look at what the Coast Guard's doing. There was a NAVIC issued earlier this year, right, that, for MITSA regulated facilities, created cybersecurity expectations. So I think even if you're not a software developer and you're in the physical supply chain, you need to be focused on technology and cyber risk. The regulators are going to be driving that.
Mira, thoughts from you?
So I think aside from the discussion we had on CFIUS and other vectors of supply chain, export controls, we're going to see that those continue to tighten as the Department of Commerce defines more fully what are the critical emerging technologies that should be protected in particular. And the trend of governments wanting and requiring more visibility into supply chains is something I believe will continue as well. In the past, a lot of these have been in areas, maybe aerospace and defense, or in medical devices and pharmaceuticals, where you need very high quality and very high standards being met. But we've seen now that this is broadening into IT and telecom, and just a great deal of focus on the kinds of issues that Adam talked about related to cyber and Russia and China in particular. So the thing that's lacking is enough of the tools to really provide you with the confidence that you know what's in your supply chain. And that's going to take time. It's also probably going to take some great innovation on the part of the private sector to come up with them. There are some good tools there that are more applicable to certain industries than others, but this is an area of potential growth because the demand is there.
Great.
And it will be one last thing. I think the companies that get ahead of this risk management and seem to be ahead of the curve, or I think they will stand above their peers, and that will be an advantage.
Great. And Mr. Secretary, I'd love to give you the last word for the webinar today.
Yeah, just a couple of things I think are going to be emerging. I think I've been involved in an effort internationally among what I would call the kind of like-minded nations, essentially, more or less liberal democracies, to come up with more transferable common standards for security and software, security and hardware, and the way we manage data, so that there can be an ease of commerce across these boundaries, recognizing that with respect to some places like Russia and China, there will be membranes and there will be obstacles. So essentially you're going to get a kind of a bifurcated global system. The other thing I would say that we've seen in our practice is increasingly companies, before they invest or set up an arrangement to get supplies from another part of the world, they want to kick the tires and get some insight as to what the stability is in the country where the resources are, because whether it be terrorism or civil unrest, if you're dependent on a particular country to provide a critical raw material and all of a sudden a war breaks out, that puts you at risk. So I think these are going to be increasingly emerging areas of focus in the current and foreseeable future. Last thing I would say is, in the end, the ability to manage these risks is actually a competitive differentiator. It's something that you can use to say to your ultimate customers, look, we look all the way down the line, so you don't have to do it. And that sense of assurance, a kind of an underwriter's laboratory for security and reliability, actually is something that can give you a real in the marketplace.
Great. Thank you, Secretary. And Adam, Mira, Mr. Secretary, thanks so much for the time over the last hour. It's been really, really insightful, and really like to thank all the participants for listening in. We can go ahead and wrap it up here, but I wish everybody a great afternoon.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you.
Thank you.